Go.
Shalom lekulam. Welcome everyone. This is our second class in the various topics in the Machshavit Rambam, the thought processes and philosophy of Rambam. This one was, according to the link, said proper government, and what it is actually is government according to Torah law. In other words, what does the halacha have to say about the proper government? So we start. What does Torah law, halacha, as summarized in Rambam's Mishneh Torah, expect a proper government to be? This shiur is going to address the following questions. First of all, is it a democracy, whether representative or otherwise? Or is it a dictatorship, or a communism, or a fascism? Or is it something else? Next, how are leaders chosen, and who is eligible to be a leader? What rights and obligations do citizens have, and who could be a citizen? And what rights and obligations do the leaders have, if any? So first of all, with respect to the form of government, and let's start with the secular rule. And I put secular in quotes because there's no such thing as actually secular according to halacha, but there is a separation between the powers that are responsible for the social order and the powers that are responsible for the halacha. And we'll discuss this in a little bit. So, Mishneh Torah lays out the halachot of government in the Laws of Kings and Wars, which is the last book of the Mishneh Torah. The very first commandment Israel, the Jews, are required to perform upon entry to the land of Israel, is to appoint a king. That's the halacha 1 in the first book. The immediate question which arises in just the two halachot afterwards is, if that's so, why was God displeased with the appointment of Shaul as king? And the reason Rambam gives there is that the Israelites appointed Shaul out of discontent rather than in order to fulfill the commandment of having a king. So, we're required to appoint a king over us. So, thus, a proper halachic government is a monarchy. Now, it's not exactly the same as the monarchies that are present today or that we even are familiar with in the past, and we'll discuss some differences. How exactly is a monarch appointed? In the Mishneh Torah, in the same book, in Halacha 4. Initially, in other words, the proper initial way, only the Sanhedrin, which is the High Court of 71, may appoint a king in conjunction with a prophet. The examples which are given there are Moshe and his court appointing Yehoshua, because Moshe was the head of the Sanhedrin as well as in fact being a king, and his court was the first Sanhedrin, and they appointed Yehoshua, who was the student of Moshe, Joshua. And another example given there is Shaul and David, both of whom were appointed by Shmuel and his court. And Shmuel is a prophet. So, who is eligible to be the king? Again, the Mishneh Torah tells us in Halacha 1:5, we may not appoint a king from among the converts to Judaism, even after several generations. Now, rather, a person going to be appointed to be a king, his mother must be a born Jew. This restriction applies not only to kingship, but also to any leadership positions, such as minister of war, generals, and so forth. The bottom line is that any position of authority in a halachic government must be held by born Jews. In halacha 6, it continues, a woman may not be appointed queen. And likewise, regarding other positions of authority, so women are not eligible to be in positions of authority in an halachic government. Nor may a high priest, the Kohen Gadol, be appointed king. In fact, this is a problem that arose when the Hashmonaim, the kings of the Hanukkah story were in power, they were Kohanim, and that was actually a particular problem. Likewise, not someone whose profession is base. In other words, someone who has a profession which is not a good profession. Examples given are tanners and barbers, among others, because the king then would be disrespected by the people. So therefore, he shouldn't be one of these sorts of people first. However, once a king is appointed, his sons inherit the kingship in halachic inheritance order. So depending on whoever's first in the order of inheritance, that person would be first in line to be the king. All that said, the Davidic line is special. In Halakha 10, the Mishneh Torah states that once David was crowned king, he and his kosher male descendants alone are eligible for kingship. That narrows down the eligible candidates considerably. However, in Halakha 11, he continues and says that if a prophet appoints a king from among the other Jewish tribes, he's nevertheless a valid king, as long as he behaves properly as king, even though the Davidic line is reserved for kingship. All that said, such a king's descendants will not be perpetually kings. Instead, the kingship will eventually revert to the Davidic line. And we've seen this through history as well. So that is as far as the secular rule goes. What about religious rule? So in addition to the king, whose authority, while broad, is restricted in scope to the maintenance of society, there is a religious branch, the Sanhedrin, the High Court of 71. They're composed of Torah sages who've received their authority individually by a process called smicha, which is the transference of authority by their teachers who themselves must have received their own smicha from their teachers. And it's important and bears noting that what we call today smicha is in no way comparable to that required of a judge in the Sanhedrin. And the reason for that is that the chain of smicha was broken, and we do not any longer have anybody who has smicha in this sense. The authority of the Sanhedrin extends to all areas of halakha. They can enact new laws or repeal old ones under certain conditions, something the king cannot do. King cannot make new laws that are religious laws. He can impose taxes and so forth, but he can't make new halakha. The Sanhedrin are the ultimate authority regarding halakha, and their decisions are considered binding on all Jews, including kings. And we did discuss this in the previous Torah topics shiur. What about citizens' rights and obligations? So, under halakha, there's two categories of citizens. First are Jews and righteous converts, which are one category. The righteous converts to Judaism, which are called Gerei Tzedek. And the second category is something called resident aliens, or Gerei Toshav. A Ger Toshav is a resident alien. The use of the term Ger in common for the latter two is sometimes confusing, but in context it's typically clear which is meant. The first category, Jews and converts, are equal under halakha with a few minor exceptions. As mentioned above, a convert cannot become king, nor can he hold one of the positions of authority in the government. Also, because converts do not descend from one of the original 12 tribes, they also do not have an inherited territory in the land. The second category, which is resident aliens, are people who are neither Jews nor wish to convert. However, they are required to adhere to the Noahide laws in order to be residents. We are not allowed, in fact, to allow people who do not adhere to the Noahide laws to reside in the land. If such people do adhere to the Noahide laws, they're permitted to reside in the land, and this is mentioned in the laws of forbidden relationships, Isurei Biyah, chapter 14, Halakha 7. However, the status of Ger Toshav, which we're talking about here, only applies when the Jubilee year laws are in effect. And that is when the majority of Jews are in the land, and that is according to the laws of Shemitah and Yovel, chapter 10, halakha 10. So what are the obligations of citizens? They're obliged to show the utmost respect to the king. That's in chapter 2, halakha 1 of Kings and Their Wars. And that includes such examples as not riding upon his horse, or in today's day, presumably his car, or using his scepter or crown, and so forth. Nor may use be made of his servants except by another king. He may not be seen unclothed, that's in halakha 3 in that chapter, or when having his hair cut, and so forth. And the bottom line is, he's to be treated always as the sovereign with honor and respect. Nobody may sit in his presence, but rather they prostrate themselves in front of him. In other words, they lay down on the ground with their arms extended. That's halakha 5. Even a prophet must stand before him rather than sit and prostrate himself. The only exception to that is the high priest. The Kohen Gadol does not stand in front of the king, rather the king stands in his presence. And this comes to emphasize that the king serves God and not the other way around. If one doesn't adhere to a king's decree because he's occupied in performing a mitzvah, he's exempt from punishment because, as the statement goes, if the master's rule or the servant's rule, you follow the master's rule, and God is the master. And of course, if a king decrees to cancel a mitzvah, he may be ignored. So even though we're required to obey the king, we don't obey him if he goes contrary to Torah law. And it is forbidden to avoid paying taxes or duties which are levied by the king. Okay, so that's essentially the obligations of the citizen towards the king. The leader's rights and obligations. The king, as mentioned above, is to be treated at all times with utmost respect. By the same token, he must behave in a manner worthy of that respect. If he's of the Davidic line, then when he's entering the Mikdash, he alone may sit, and no one else is permitted to sit in the Mikdash. The king must have his hair cut every day, that's halakha 5, chapter 2, and he must dress himself in royal garments and sit on his throne instead of just in an easy chair, and place his crown upon his head. So he has to look like a king. Other than that, he must show respect for Torah scholars. He must not be haughty, and he must be merciful to all his subjects. And one which is directly in the Torah, he must write a second Torah scroll for himself. And that comes in addition to the one that every Jew must write for himself. One scroll he has to place in his treasury, and the other one he has to carry with him all the time, except when he goes to the bathroom or other places where a Torah scroll is not permitted to be. Restrictions on the king. He may not have many wives, and that means not more than 18 simultaneously, whether they're wives or pilegshim. And a pilegish is what's called in English a concubine, but a pilegish is a wife who is not given a ketubah, so it's a wife without a ketubah, and only a king can have a pilegish. So let's clarify that, lest some people are confused on that notion. Nor may he have many horses, nor may he have excessive gold and silver. These are all direct Torah commandments, and they ensure that the king does not indulge himself, and likewise, he may not drink to excess. Instead, he must engage in Torah study and work on the public's needs day and night. And despite his allowance of 18 wives, he must not be immersed in women. In other words, he should not be in his harem all the time, just having a good time. The king has the right to execute anyone who rebels against him, even for minor infractions of his laws. And similarly, he has that right if they curse or otherwise disrespect him. However, he may only execute with a sword. He can't hang them or whatever. He also has the right to imprison and whip offenders if he chooses. However, he's not permitted to take other people's money, and if he does, it's considered robbery. The king also has permission to execute those who murder, even in the cases where there's no clear evidence, nor witnesses, nor warning, which is the way the Sanhedrin which are the requirements in front of the Sanhedrin for it to be able to execute a murderer. And he's allowed this in order to repair society, to fix society, which is the actual meaning of tikkun olam. In monetary matters, he has the right to tax as he wishes for his needs or for the purpose of conducting a war. He can collect duties. He can gather up healthy men from among his citizens to serve him in various capacities. Similarly, he can gather up professionals and craftsmen of various types to serve his needs. And he can gather up wives and pilagshim from across Israel. And in summary, a government, according to Halacha, is a monarchy with restricted powers in the executive branch, that is the king, and a religious Supreme Court which acts as the legislative branch. The citizens have equal rights, and in general, the government only interferes in their lives to keep the general peace and to conduct war.